So as of this recording, here's the latest on the congressional inquiry into the impeachment of Donald Trump. A group of White House officials has refused to appear for closed-door depositions, most notably John Eisenberg, Deputy Counsel to the President for National Security Affairs, who proposed moving the full transcript of President Trump's call with the President of Ukraine to a server intended to hold highly classified information. Eisenberg and the others who were called to speak with House investigators are not the first members of the Trump administration to fail to show up. In fact, blowing off congressional subpoenas has become central to Trump's impeachment strategy. Trump's position is that he doesn't have to allow witnesses to speak to investigators because he didn't do anything wrong. Trump's position is also that he is being denied due process. Investigators speaking to witnesses and gathering evidence is part of due process. If Trump were being denied due process, the Democrats would simply throw together some articles of impeachment and vote on them without giving Trump, his people, or his Republican allies a chance to participate in the process. But the Democrats are doing the opposite of that. They're conducting an investigation. And Trump and his people are refusing to participate, and their Republican allies in Congress are doing everything they can to interrupt that investigation. So the people complaining about lack of due process are the ones who are working on a daily basis to thwart the due process that is being conducted. Sound backwards? That's because Trump is acting like he, the subject of the investigation, ought to be in charge of it. A few hours before Eisenberg and the other witnesses refused to appear, Trump tweeted, "What I said on the phone call with the Ukrainian president is perfectly stated. There is no reason to call witnesses to analyze my words and meaning." Note the quotes around perfectly there. Is that a Freudian slip? Or the result of the President of the United States failing to grasp the basic mechanics of writing in the only language he can speak? In the wise words of Forrest Gump, maybe it's both. Anyway, what Trump is doing there is saying, I shouldn't have to let witnesses testify because there's no reason for witnesses to testify. He reiterated this position a few hours later when he tweeted, "Read the transcript." There are two key points to remember here. First, there are actually a lot of reasons to call witnesses to testify about that call with the President of Ukraine. There are lots of questions I can imagine House investigators wanting to ask John Eisenberg. Questions like, so do you agree with President Trump that there was nothing inappropriate going on during his phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky? And if you do agree that Trump did nothing wrong on the call, why did you want to move the records of the call to a highly classified server? Why did many other government officials with first-hand knowledge of the call seem immediately concerned? And why did several of them try to conceal the content of the call from others? If Trump's call with Zelensky was completely innocent, and obviously so, as Trump has continuously insisted in his own babbling, semi-literate way, why is it no one in the White House seemed to treat it that way? These are all questions lawmakers involved in the impeachment inquiry might want the answers to because they point at fundamental inconsistencies in Trump's position relative to the Ukraine call. If he did nothing wrong, and everyone knows he did nothing wrong, why did his people immediately try to hide what he did? But there's another point here, and it's more a matter of principle than of fact. Donald Trump is the subject of this inquiry. If this were a more traditional criminal investigation, he'd be the suspect. The suspect doesn't get to run the investigation. Trump's been acting as though he thinks investigations into him should be run like in that Chappelle Show sketch that made fun of how cops treat suspects in white-collar crime differently than suspects in street crime. Remember Chappelle Show? The genius sketch series Dave Chappelle made before he decided that regularly veering far out of his way to kick trans people in the teeth to get laughs out of the shittiest members of his audience was a good use of his talents. Anyway, there was that sketch where Dave was like, what if the cops investigated drug dealers the same way they investigate guys on Wall Street who steal like millions of dollars from people? And we see the detectives being ridiculously deferential to the obviously guilty drug dealer who delights in dicking them around and insists on setting the terms of the investigation, knowing the cops will be too scared of him to object. It's like Trump saw that sketch, or more likely was told about that sketch by someone a few years ago and now only half remembers, but is sure he got the point of it, and has been using the intentionally absurd way those fake cops treated that fake suspect as the basis for his expectations of how an investigation should be run. Shit, what am I even saying? Trump doesn't need to refer to that sketch. He is literally the sort of rich criminal that sketch was referring to. He expects investigators to just kind of take his word for shit and drop the case because he's used to them doing that. This whole being held accountable for his crimes thing is entirely new to him. Trump's expectations for how the investigators ought to be treating him aren't the only things that have been flipped around. Trump's defense against the accusations driving the impeachment inquiry is predicated on his insistence that things which we all see happening aren't happening. It's not just the phone call with the Ukrainian president, which he claims is perfect while others see shockingly blatant corruption. It's the fact that Trump and his Republican lapdogs in Congress keep insisting that the Democrats are trying to pull off some sort of secret coup when the House hasn't taken any action against Trump whatsoever up to this point, nor have they even specifically talked about taking action against Trump. The only thing they voted on so far is a resolution to formalize the procedures of their inquiry. And despite the childish protests of Republicans like Matt Gaetz, Republican members of Congress have been included in that inquiry at every step along the way. I say this as a registered and often very frustrated member of the Democratic Party. The Democrats are bipartisan to a fault. They have made as much room in this investigation for the Republicans as precedent and procedure demands, and more too. The only reason this impeachment inquiry has been one-sided is because instead of participating in it, as they have repeatedly been invited to do, the Republicans have chosen instead to close ranks around Trump and try to frustrate and discredit the inquiry. Look, I acknowledge that since the Ukraine call, the Democrats have discovered a few inches of backbone, and I'm grateful for that. But overall, this impeachment inquiry has so far gone the same way everything else on Capitol Hill has gone since the election of President Obama to his first term. The Democrats pull out chairs for Republicans to have seats at the table. The Republicans walk up and flip over that table. The Democrats set the table back up and pull out chairs for the Republicans again. And they call this never-ending cycle of self-defeating masochism taking the high road. If fascists like Trump and his underlings ever entrench themselves in government deep enough that they can't be driven from power by a mere election result, I'm sure the rest of us will be grateful to the Democrats for fighting back as hard as they could fight without looking too partisan. 2 Democrats even voted against that resolution to formalize the impeachment inquiry. Minnesota Representative Colin Peterson and New Jersey Representative Jeff Van Drew both opposed the resolution because they felt the impeachment process is only serving to further divide the country. Can you imagine how cowardly and spineless and useless a human being has to be to not only vote against an impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump at this point, but to blame that impeachment inquiry for dividing the country instead of blaming Trump and the Republicans, the people who have traded their well-worn dog whistles for bullhorns and made racism, misogyny, anti-LGBTQ bigotry, and anti-immigrant fear-mongering central to their political identity. Trump and the Republican Party have done all of that and more. They have embraced and defended brazen criminality and corruption, and yet somehow, according to Trump and his supporters, not to mention Democratic Representatives Peterson and Van Drew, it's the Democrats and their tentative, extremely belated impeachment inquiry that is dividing the nation. The most frustrating thing about this whole situation is that Trump has committed his numerous impeachable offenses right out in the open, in front of multiple witnesses, in front of reporters and television cameras, in front of the entire world. And there are still people, even some who aren't obviously and irretrievably in the tank for Trump, who just aren't sure about this whole impeachment thing. It really comes down to a single question. To paraphrase Chico Marx's character in Duck Soup, who are you going to believe? Donald Trump or your lying eyes?